All right, so today we're going to be looking at the HBO miniseries Chernobyl. And you've given me a very interesting mix of sources here. Stuff about the show itself, critical reviews, audience reviews, some from people who were actually there. It's really quite something.
Yeah, it's a pretty potent mix. And it brings up something interesting, doesn't it? We're not just dealing with a historical event, but also with how that event has been portrayed through this miniseries.
Right, exactly. So for those who maybe haven't seen it, Chernobyl is a 2019 historical drama. Chronicles the 1986 Chernobyl nuclear disaster, and it was critically acclaimed. I mean, it won 10 Primetime Emmys and a Golden Globe.
Mhm.
But even with all that praise, there's been this ongoing debate about how historically accurate the show actually is.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Mm.
You have sources, like IMDb, for example, that talk about all the detail they went to in recreating Pripyat. And the power plant. They even filmed at the Ignalina nuclear power plant in Lithuania, which is often called Chernobyl's sister because it looks so similar and uses the same kind of reactor.
Wow, that's really something. But then on the other hand, you have these user reviews that call out factual inaccuracies. Like, some people point out how often the characters say comrade when they talk to each other. They're saying that level of formality wasn't really common for colleagues back then.
And it's not just the dialogue either. The casting choices have also been criticized. A lot of viewers, especially those familiar with the Soviet Union, found it strange that most of the actors are British and speaking English,
Yeah.
instead of a cast that actually reflects the nationalities and languages of that region.
Yeah, it really does raise questions about where you draw the line between taking creative liberties and staying true to history, whether accuracy should even extend to things like language and casting. But also makes you wonder about the viewers who actually lived through Chernobyl. How did they respond to the series?
That's where it gets really fascinating. We actually have reviews from people who were there, who experienced the evacuation firsthand. The fear, the uncertainty, it adds this whole other layer to the conversation.
Absolutely. Like one reviewer who was born in Pripyat, they described being evacuated as a child, and that was just a normal day. No warning, no sign of anything wrong. Their family packed this small bag because they thought they'd be back in 3 days. It's chilling.
Yeah, that sense of normalcy being totally shattered, that's something that comes up again and again in these firsthand accounts. There's another viewer whose father actually worked at the Chernobyl plant. They talk about how watching the show brought back all these memories. The fear, the not knowing what was going to happen next, it was very powerful for them.
It's really incredible how a show can evoke such strong emotions, especially from people who went through the real event. But it makes me think about something you mentioned earlier, this idea of interpretation. Maybe being 100% historically accurate isn't the only thing that matters.
I think you're right. Despite all the debate about specific details, a lot of these firsthand accounts actually praise the show for its authenticity. They say it captures the feeling of the Soviet era, the gravity of the disaster, the emotional truth of it.
So in a way, it's tapping into something deeper, something that goes beyond whether every single fact is perfectly accurate.
Exactly. And it makes you think maybe that emotional truth is even more effective in conveying the human cost of this tragedy. But speaking of truth, the series also touches on the political side of Chernobyl.
Oh, yeah. One of the major themes that comes up both in the show and in the audience reviews is this critique of how secretive the Soviet regime was about the whole thing and how much misinformation they spread.
It's almost impossible to talk about the disaster without talking about how the Soviet system handled it. Many viewers pointed out this stark contrast. How the Soviets approached Chernobyl versus how other nations responded to similar events, like Japan with the Fukushima disaster, for instance.
Right. One user even brought up that Russia's planning to make its own version of Chernobyl, potentially blaming the whole thing on the CIA. Really shows how this event is still controversial and how different narratives still exist.
It definitely shows how historical events can be intertwined with political agendas and biases, even decades later. It's never as simple as just what happened. There's always the question of who's telling the story and why.
That's a really important point. But going back to the series itself, the creators have said that the central theme of Chernobyl is the cost of lies. And that's something that comes through really strongly in the whole miniseries. From the very beginning when they try to cover up the disaster to the long-term consequences of the government trying to control the narrative.
And it's fascinating to see how that theme has resonated with viewers. A lot of the reviews emphasize how important it is to be open and truthful, especially when you're dealing with a crisis like this.
It makes you think maybe that message is even more relevant now than ever. In a world where we're constantly bombarded with information and misinformation, figuring out what's true and what's not is a real challenge.
Absolutely. And that's what makes the show's exploration of individual conscience versus a system that punishes dissent so interesting. You see those internal struggles play out.
Yeah, you see characters like Valery Legasov, the chief scientific investigator. He knows the truth, but he's up against a system that wants to bury it. It raises these really deep questions about what responsibility individuals have when they're part of powerful institutions.
Exactly. And that tension isn't just limited to the Soviet era either. It's something that people grapple with across time and cultures. It makes you think about the choices we all face in our own lives when our personal values clash with the expectations of the systems we're a part of.
It's a theme that can really connect with viewers on a personal level. It's not just about a historical event. It's about the choices we make every day and how those choices can have consequences.
Precisely. And that's what makes Chernobyl such a powerful piece of storytelling.
Yeah.
It goes beyond the historical context and speaks to something much deeper about being human. It really does. But the show also doesn't shy away from the really horrific side of the disaster. It does a good job of showing the devastating impact of radiation poisoning, something that's hard to truly understand if you haven't experienced it.
Yeah, it's one of those things that's hard to convey with just facts and figures. But Chernobyl really makes it visceral. You see the human cost in a way that you just can't with statistics.
It's true. It's hard to imagine. Imagine you're a firefighter. You just think it's an ordinary fire. Then, a few days later, you're brushing your teeth, and your gums start bleeding uncontrollably. That's the radiation, doing its thing, at a cellular level. The show really doesn't hold back.
That's a really powerful way to put it. And yet, even with all that horror, Chernobyl also shows these incredible acts of heroism. The firefighters, the people who worked at the plant, the liquidators, the ones who had to clean up the radioactive debris, they all risked their lives to contain the disaster.
And to really grasp the scale of that sacrifice, it helps to understand a bit about the reactor itself, the RBMK-1000. You see, it had these graphite tips on the control rods, which, believe it or not, actually made the reaction worse at first when they were inserted.
Really? So instead of slowing things down, they actually made things worse?
Yeah, exactly. It was a flaw in the design, a major one. And the liquidators, many of them knowing the risks, they still went in. Over 3 years, more than 750,000 men were exposed to just unimaginable levels of radiation.
Wow, that's hard to even comprehend. And actually, speaking of the liquidators, that term might be new to some people listening. They weren't like a specific unit or anything, were they?
No, not really. It was a really mixed group. Soldiers, miners, engineers, ordinary people called upon to do this incredibly dangerous job. A lot of them got very little training, inadequate protection. They were really sacrificing themselves to try and mitigate the effects of the disaster.
It's no wonder reviewers talk about the experience of watching the show as being more horrifying than living through it, even for those who weren't directly involved.
That says a lot about the show's ability to evoke not just intellectual understanding, but a real emotional response, to capture that sense of dread that must have permeated everything.
You mentioned how Chernobyl weaves together the past and the present. These flashbacks they use, they're not just a storytelling gimmick. They're actually quite clever, aren't they?
They are, yeah. Instead of a straightforward timeline, the show uses those flashbacks to reveal information gradually, bit by bit. It really builds suspense, because as viewers, we're trying to figure out what happened alongside the characters.
So it's like a detective story almost. We're constantly reevaluating what we think happened as more information is revealed.
Right, and it keeps us emotionally invested, mirroring the confusion and growing dread that those involved must have felt. It's really skillfully done.
This weaving of personal stories with the bigger political and scientific context, it's really fascinating. But I'm curious, from your perspective, what makes Chernobyl such an effective story?
I think it's that balance it strikes. You get enough of the technical details to understand how serious the situation was, but the focus is on the people, the choices they made, the consequences they faced.
One review I read mentioned how even Anatoly Dyatlov, the deputy chief engineer, the one who was in charge of that fateful test, he's portrayed with some complexity. At first, he seems really rigid, almost like a villain, but then you see these moments of humanity, of vulnerability.
Exactly. It would have been easy to just make him the bad guy, but the show goes deeper than that. We see the pressure he was under, the culture of fear in the Soviet system. It makes you question how much his actions were due to his own flaws versus the system he was operating in.
Which brings us back to this idea of individual versus the system, right? Were these people just reckless? Or were they shaped by this system that didn't allow for questioning, that valued obedience above all else. That seems like something that goes way beyond just Chernobyl.
Absolutely. It makes us think about how much freedom do we really have within the systems that we
Right.
live in? Can we speak up against authority, disobey orders, even when we know they're wrong? That's a question that's relevant to everyone, not just people who lived in the Soviet Union.
Makes me think about whistleblowers, people who risk everything, their careers, their reputations, to expose what's going on in powerful organizations.
And the incredible pressure they face. Chernobyl shows how easily dissent can be silenced, how conformity can be rewarded, even when lives are on the line.
That's a really scary thought. But for a moment, let's talk about the visuals. People have praised Chernobyl for creating this incredibly bleak, almost haunting atmosphere. How do they achieve that visually?
Well, there are a lot of factors at play. The colors are muted, the images are stark, you often see these claustrophobic shots. It all contributes to this feeling of unease and impending doom. And the abandoned city of Pripyat, it's frozen in time. It becomes this eerie, almost post-apocalyptic landscape.
And the sound design is amazing, too. The Geiger counter's constantly clicking, the muffled coughs of the people suffering from radiation sickness, the eerie silence that hangs over everything. It all adds so much to the show's impact.
Sound is such a powerful tool, for evoking emotion, for creating a sense of place. And in Chernobyl, it's used masterfully to heighten the tension and really immerse you in that world of unseen danger.
I have to admit, before I saw Chernobyl, I didn't really understand the disaster very well. I knew it was a big nuclear accident, but the details were hazy. I imagine a lot of people are in the same boat.
Yeah, probably. And that's why the show is so important. It's not just entertainment. It's a tool for learning, for reflection. It forces us to confront the reality of what happened, to understand the science, to grapple with the human cost.
And to think about the long-term effects. Not just on the region, but on how we understand the dangers of nuclear power. Feels like Chernobyl has made the event relevant again. It's less of a historical footnote and more of a living tragedy that has lessons for us today.
And those lessons go beyond just nuclear science. Chernobyl is a warning about the dangers of unchecked power, of suppressing the truth, of putting politics ahead of human life.
It reminds us that even with all our technology, we're still vulnerable to human error, to failures in our systems, and that being watchful, being transparent, being willing to learn from our mistakes is crucial to prevent these kinds of disasters from happening again.
Absolutely. And on a more personal level, Chernobyl makes us think about our own place in the systems we're part of. Are we just passive participants going along with things even when we know they're wrong? Or are we willing to speak up to challenge things even if it makes us uncomfortable?
It's a powerful question that the show really forces us to confront. But let's shift gears a bit. Let's talk about the impact Chernobyl has had. It's generated a lot of discussion and debate, hasn't it?
It really has. Since it came out, Chernobyl has inspired so many articles, podcasts, documentaries, all exploring the disaster. It's clear that the show really tapped into a deep curiosity.
It's not just entertainment. It's sparked this desire to learn more, to understand, to really engage with this historical event. It's almost like Chernobyl has breathed new life into the event, making people think about its relevance to today.
And you can see that in how tourism to Chernobyl has increased. People are drawn to the site of the tragedy. They want to see it for themselves, to connect with history in a very tangible way. But that also raises some ethical questions, doesn't it?
It does. Where's the line between remembering respectfully and exploiting tragedy for entertainment? What do you think about that?
It's a complex issue. On the one hand, visiting places like Chernobyl can be a powerful way to learn, to pay your respects, to really understand the scale of what happened.
But there's always that risk of sensationalizing the tragedy, turning a place of suffering into a spectacle.
Exactly. And I think it's really important for anyone who visits Chernobyl to be sensitive, to be respectful, to remember that real people lived and died there. It's not just a backdrop for selfies and Instagram.
It's about remembering the human cost. The lives lost, the communities torn apart, the long-term consequences.
And Chernobyl is so good at reminding us of that. It gives faces to the statistics, stories to the events. It makes the tragedy feel real and powerful.
So, we've talked about the historical context, the way the story is told, the impact Chernobyl has had. Let's talk about how the critics saw it. It received pretty much universal praise, didn't it?
Yeah, it really did. The show has near-perfect scores on sites like Rotten Tomatoes and Metacritic. Critics loved the writing, the acting, the direction. Chernobyl really struck a chord with audiences and critics alike.
Why do you think it was so well received? What sets it apart from other historical dramas?
I think it comes down to how Chernobyl manages to balance accuracy with great storytelling. Well, it does take some creative liberties. It's obvious that the creators did their homework. They really tried to present a truthful account while also creating something engaging and thought-provoking.
That commitment to authenticity definitely comes through, and it's helped by all the attention to detail. The costumes, the sets, the way people talk, the accents, it all feels so meticulously researched and true to the time.
And the performances are incredible. Jared Harris as Valerie Legasov, Stellan Skarsgård as Boris Shubina, Emily Watson as Ulana Komyuk. They all give these really nuanced and powerful performances. Their characters are complex, grappling with an unimaginable situation.
They're really captivating to watch. You feel the weight of what's happening, the moral dilemmas, the sacrifices they're making. It's more than just a historical drama. It's a reflection on what it means to be human, the choices we make when things get tough.
And those choices, as the show so powerfully illustrates, can have huge and often unintended consequences.
Okay, we talked about the critical response, but Chernobyl also won a ton of awards, didn't it?
Oh, it cleaned up. It was
Yeah.
nominated for 19 Primetime Emmy Awards, won 10 of them, including Outstanding Limited Series, Outstanding Directing for Johan Rank, and Outstanding Writing for Craig Mazin. It also picked up 2 Golden Globes, one for Best Miniseries or Television Film.
Wow, that's amazing. It really solidifies Chernobyl's place as a major television event.
It does, and it shows how much of an impact the show has had. Years after its release, people are still talking about Chernobyl, thinking about its themes, making connections to things happening today.
It's the kind of show that stays with you, a real testament to the power of storytelling, to educate and challenge as much as to entertain.
You know, Chernobyl touches on some really deep themes: the dangers of secrecy and misinformation, the struggle between individual conscience and what the system demands, the importance of scientific truth, the human cost of disaster. All these threads are woven throughout the narrative.
And those themes resonate with people because they're not just about Chernobyl. They're about the human condition, the challenges we face as individuals and as a society.
That's right. Chernobyl is like a parable for our times, a warning about what happens when we become complacent, when we don't hold people accountable, and about the importance of courage in the face of adversity.
It's a reminder that we can't just ignore the past. The choices we make today have consequences that can last for generations.
It's a call to action, to be more informed, more engaged, more willing to speak truth to power, even when it's hard.
And to remember that even when things are at their worst, there's always hope. The human spirit is resilient. Compassion always has the power to shine through.
And that's such an important message, one that we need to hear. But beyond these big themes, Chernobyl also goes into the specifics of the disaster. It gives us a deeper understanding of the science behind it.
It's really impressive how they make those technical details accessible, even if you don't know much about nuclear physics.
Yeah, that's key to the show's success. It doesn't oversimplify things, but it explains the science in a way that's clear and understandable.
Like how they break down the problems with the reactor design. The way those graphite tips actually made the reaction faster instead of slowing it down. It seems counterintuitive, but the show makes it make sense.
Exactly. And by understanding the technical side, we can appreciate how huge this disaster was and the challenges those trying to contain it had to face.
It also highlights how important it is to understand science, especially today when we rely on such complex technology. Chernobyl reminds us that we can't afford to be ignorant about the science behind the things we use every day.
And to be wary of those in power who might twist or downplay scientific facts for their own benefit. The show really shows how the Soviet government's attempts to control what people knew about the disaster just made things worse.
Right. They denied it at first, downplayed how bad it was, and that allowed the radiation to spread and put more people at risk. It's a stark lesson in the importance of honesty and openness, especially during a crisis.
And a reminder of how dangerous it can be to silence those who speak out, whether they're scientists, journalists, or regular citizens.
You know, one thing that struck me about Chernobyl is the portrayal of the Soviet Union. It's not just a setting, it's like a character itself.
Definitely. The show depicts a society shrouded in secrecy, where fear is rampant, where the government doesn't trust its own people. And we see how that environment, that system, contributed to the disaster and made it harder to contain.
It's not a simple portrayal, though. It's not like they're painting the Soviet Union as this evil empire. We see acts of courage, compassion, even defiance within the system.
That's what makes it so interesting. It acknowledges the complexity of the Soviet system and the people who live within it. We see how ordinary people navigated that world of fear and control, making choices that ranged from heroic sacrifice to complicit silence.
It reminds us that even in the most oppressive regimes, human nature still exists. And even in flawed systems, there's always the possibility for individual acts of courage and resistance.
Chernobyl doesn't offer easy answers. It doesn't try to simplify things. It asks us to consider the complexities of history, the subtleties of human behavior, and how those things, individuals and systems, interact to shape events.
It's a show that makes you think, that sparks discussion, maybe even some soul-searching. It makes us examine our own values, our choices, and our role in the systems that govern our lives.
And to imagine what we would do if we were in those situations, facing those ethical dilemmas, that pressure to conform or to dissent.
It's a lot to process, and yet, even with such a heavy subject matter, Chernobyl finds those moments of hope, moments that show the resilience of people, the lasting power of compassion.
It's really a credit to the creators that they were able to do that, to find those moments of grace in the midst of tragedy, to remind us that even when facing unimaginable suffering, human kindness and courage can still win out.
We've covered a lot of ground here. We talked about the history, the science behind the disaster, how the story is told, the cultural impact, what the critics said. But I want to know, what stands out to you? What are your main takeaways from looking at Chernobyl through this lens?
I think what sticks with me is how relevant the themes of the show still are today. The danger of secrecy and lies, the struggle between what we believe and what the system wants, the cost of disasters. These are things that are just as important today as they were back then.
That's true. Chernobyl isn't just a story from the past. It's a reflection of our own anxieties, our own struggles, our capacity for both good and bad.
And a reminder that what we do as individuals and as a society can shape the course of history. Whether we choose to speak up, to challenge the norm, to act with courage and kindness, those choices will determine the future we create.
It's a lot to think about, but it's an important conversation to have, and I think Chernobyl gives us a really strong framework for thinking about these issues, for understanding the complexities of the world, and for finding hope even in the darkest of times.
It really is. It doesn't give you easy answers, that's for sure, but it makes you ask the right questions. And that's a good place to start, isn't it? Asking the right questions.
Yeah, I think so. You know, it's interesting to see how differently people have interpreted Chernobyl. Some see it as this big warning about nuclear power. Others see it as a critique of political systems that value control over being transparent.
That says a lot about how powerful the storytelling is, don't you think? It's not a simple story. It lets viewers bring their own experiences and perspectives into it.
It's like a prism, reflecting different aspects of the truth depending on where you're looking from. Like that saying, every story has at least two sides.
Yeah, exactly. And it's that space in between where those different perspectives clash that you get the really interesting conversations.
So as we wrap up our look at Chernobyl, what stands out to you the most? What are your biggest takeaways from all this?
Honestly, it always comes back to the power of truth for me. The show really drives home how trying to hide or twist the truth can have terrible, even catastrophic consequences. And it's a good reminder that even when there's immense pressure, there will always be people who seek the truth, who fight for it, no matter what.
It's kind of scary to think, are we right now in the middle of some kind of misinformation event that we just don't recognize yet? Are there truths being hidden that will have consequences down the line?
It's a chilling thought, isn't it? But it's worth considering. And it underscores how important it is to think critically, to be skeptical, to look for different viewpoints. We can't just passively accept information, especially these days.
It's like the show's telling us we need to be more active, more engaged, to really guard the truth and hold those in power accountable.
Exactly. And to recognize that staying silent, even if it's out of fear, can be just as damaging as lying. Chernobyl really drives that point home. We all have a role to play in shaping the narrative, in demanding transparency, in speaking truth to power.
And in recognizing how our actions can impact others, not just ourselves, people around us, even future generations.
That's right. We tend to think of history as something far removed, something in textbooks. But Chernobyl shows us how the past can echo into the present.
And how the choices we make today, the truths we choose to embrace or ignore, those can have consequences we might not even imagine.
So to wrap this all up, I want to leave you with one last thought. If Chernobyl is a cautionary tale for us today, what are those lies we're telling ourselves as individuals and as a society? What will those lies cost us in the end?
That's a really powerful question, one that we should all think about carefully. It's not easy to look inward, to examine what we believe and what we do, but we have to do it. We need to make sure we're building a culture of truth and accountability, not one of complacency and denial.
It's not an easy task,
Yeah.
but it's so important because as Chernobyl shows us, the truth, even if it's hard to face, ultimately sets us free.
And sometimes facing that truth, even when it hurts, is the only way to build a better future. Well, this has been quite a journey. Thanks for joining us today.
It has. Until next time, keep asking those difficult questions. Never stop seeking the truth wherever it leads you.